Okay, it's been a little while since we've done art in this course. So we're going to do quite a lot in this one talk. We're going to cover early Christian, Byzantine, and Islamic art. This is a real turning point, not just for Humanities 101, but for the entire humanities program at Milligan, because from this point onward, almost all the art you'll be looking at is either explicitly Christian or was produced in a sort of Christian context. Now, as you will learn from this week's readings, there have been various points in Christian history and indeed non-Christian history when people become quite anxious about religious art and begin to wonder whether it's appropriate at all. And there have even been in the history of the church a couple instances of iconoclasm, which is the destruction of images. And one of those outbursts is discussed in your West in the World reading this week. It happened in the Byzantine Empire. If you take Humanities 102, you'll read about another such outburst in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. And we're going to see at the end of this talk that Muslims, while not opposed to religious art, put some pretty severe strictures on what is permissible in terms of religious art. Now, as best as we can tell, the early Christians themselves did not really have those kinds of reservations. And if you think about the fact that, for instance, the literacy rate in the ancient world in general, was something like 10%, you can begin to imagine why images were so important. I mean, that would be the way that most people learned Bible stories, for instance. One sort of interesting point, and I'm just going to make the point and then not really kind of come back to this topic, but we also know that, right around the same time as we see the earliest Christian art, we see Jewish religious art as well. And here's one example from a synagogue in Jura Europos, Moses giving water to the 12 tribes of Israel. You might think, given the prohibition against making graven images, that Jews would be opposed to religious art, period, but we know that that was not the case. Now, what is the very earliest Christian art that has come down to us today? Well, most of the earliest art can be found in catacombs. A catacomb is an underground burial place, basically. And what you can see right here is a discovery made by archaeologists in 2010. This is in Rome. Most of the early Christian catacombs were in the city of Rome. And I think you can probably make out what you're looking at here. It's a young shepherd with a couple of sheep on the ground and then one sheep slung over his neck. And this is almost certainly a depiction of Jesus. We know that because the most popular and prevalent type of depiction of Jesus in early Christianity was, not a kind of bearded judge or king, but rather a young, beardless shepherd. So a couple of the works that you are expected to know from this unit illustrate this. So we have this sculpture, this statue of the Good Shepherd from around the year 300, fast forwarding a little over 100 years, a mosaic from Ravenna known as Christ as the Good Shepherd. So this was a very common motif in early Christian art. All right, I want to talk a little bit about early Christian architecture for a moment. Now, it's not until the 3rd century that Christians begin building dedicated church buildings. And I think you know enough already to be able to explain why that's the case, right? Christianity is not legal in the Roman Empire until the early 4th century. And so Christians have to kind of keep a low architectural profile prior to that. Now, Constantine comes along. Constantine not only legalizes Christianity, but also showers favors on the church and builds churches all over the Roman Empire. And so we start to see quite impressive works of art being produced by Christians in the 4th century. I promise we'll talk about architecture. We'll get there in just a second. But first, I wanted to show you this sarcophagus or tomb of Junius Bassus, who was a Christian Roman prefect. He was someone so important that his sarcophagus was placed next to the tomb of Peter in St. Peter's Basilica, which we'll talk about in just a second. Obviously, it would have been a very expensive work of art. And one of the things that's so significant about this work is the way that it brings together sort of classical Greco-Roman style with Christian subject matter. You've seen enough Greco-Roman art at this point that you can recognize that very familiar style. What you're not used to is seeing Bible stories being depicted in that style. And here I have a close-up. If you look sort of at the middle left, you'll see an enthroned Christ. Again, notice young, beardless, an enthroned Christ flanked by 2 apostles. What's interesting is you'll notice that the throne is sort of being held up by this bearded figure who is a representation of the Roman god Caius. So we have this mixture of Christian and pagan imagery. Now, that's not to say that whoever commissioned this actually believed that those gods were real. But we're going to see a lot of this in the centuries to come, this kind of synthesis of Christian and Greco-Roman iconography. Okay, so I promised we talk about architecture, and I've already mentioned St. Peter's. Now, almost all of you, I'm sure, have seen images of the new St. Peter's in Rome, which was built in the 16th century. But prior to that church, there was a impressive but smaller church, which is now known as Old St. Peter's Basilica. And I want you to know that word. I mean, hopefully, you know, when you're listening to an art lecture like this, you've got your study guide handy. Because there's a certain number of words you need to be able to identify or define, and it's my job to do that for you, so you want to pay close attention when I do that. A basilica is an architectural form that Christians do not invent, okay? It is an established Roman form of architecture. It was used for, basilicas were used for things like law courts or assembly halls or commercial spaces. The main point being that the basilica was not an architectural form associated with pagan temples. So that actually made it much more usable for early Christians. It didn't have pagan associations. Now, in terms of what a basilica is, well, it's pretty dead simple. I mean, a basilica is essentially, you know, stripped to its essentials, a rectangular building, okay? Now, often, and you see this here, it has a couple of additional elements. And again, here are some terms that you want to know. And these are terms, by the way, that will not just serve you well this unit of the course, but going forward in humanities. So the main assembly area, so if you look at that sort of rectangle that makes up the left side of the building, that's known as the nave. And so that's where the worshipers would assemble for worship, the nave. But you also notice on the extreme left, there's a semicircular area. That's the apse, A-P-S-E. And that's sort of providing a kind of setting for the altar, which is the focal point of the building. And you'll also notice there's another rectangle that intersects the nave perpendicularly. And that is the transept. The transept, again, these terms are on your study guide. Okay, so I promise it's worth it to go ahead and learn these terms and to know what they mean, because we'll be using them later in humanities. So the basilica becomes one of the most dominant architectural forms when it comes to early Christian churches, really from the 4th century onward. But now I want to look at a couple of Byzantine churches. You know, when we talk about the Byzantine Empire, we're basically talking about the eastern half of the Roman Empire that survives after the western half has fallen. I want to look at 2 churches from the Byzantine Empire. Neither of them are basilicas. What they have in common, well, they have some architectural features in common, but what they also have in common is that they were built by Justinian, who, as you will learn from your West in the World reading, is really one of the central figures of this period of time. He's emperor in the mid-6th century. So the first one of his buildings I want to look at is San Vitale in Ravenna, which is in sort of northeastern Italy. You can tell immediately by looking at it that this is not a basilica, because the rectangle is not the dominant geometrical form here. This is known as a central plan church. A central plan church is basically a kind of round church that is organized around a central spot. So the main axis is vertical rather than horizontal. And it is often, although not always, a domed structure. Okay. Now, if we go back for a moment and we look at Old St. Peter's, we'll see that the architectural form, especially with the transept there, has some theological significance. But because by adding that transept, you've created a cross shape. And I don't think I need to tell you why that's significant for Christians. But there's also a kind of theological significance to this circular shape as well. It is not only a kind of perfect form, but is a symbol of eternity, because circles neither begin nor end. And once again, Christians don't invent this form of architecture. They adapt it from the Romans. Now you'll see in terms of the main features, they have many of the main features in common with the basilica. There is a nave, for instance. There is an apse, but the nave here is basically circular rather than rectangular. One other thing that central plan churches usually had in common with basilicas is that they were oriented toward the east. That is, the altars were on the eastern ends of the church, usually. And there's several reasons for this, and there's symbolic reasons. First of all, the east is, of course, the place where the sun rises. It is associated with light, as opposed to the west, which is associated with darkness. And also, if you're in Western Europe, Jerusalem is to the east, and Jerusalem is where the second coming of Christ was expected to happen. So there's this sense of anticipation of the second coming of Christ. All right, so that what you're looking at is the sort of blueprint, as it were, of San Vitale. I wanted to show you what it looks like from the outside. This is very typical of Byzantine churches. Yes, the red brick, but also simply the fact that it's rather plain. I would never suggest that this is an ugly building from the exterior, but it is kind of severe, that there's no real decoration. It kind of looks like a very handsome water pumping station or something like that. But get a load of what it looks like inside. Okay, quite a contrast. And again, that juxtaposition between a rather drab exterior and a kind of glorious interior is typical of Byzantine churches. And take a moment to just think about the possible theological significance of that juxtaposition. I'll just give you one possibility. Think about the person of Christ, right? It was church teaching by this point that Christ was fully human and fully divine. Now, from the outside, Christ may appear simply as an ordinary human being, but Christians believe that actually Christ is the Son of God incarnate. And so that may be in some ways symbolized by this sort of ordinary exterior, extraordinary interior here. All right, one of the reasons why this church is so famous is because of its mosaics. And I think we've already talked about mosaics in this class. They're not paintings, right? They're the two-dimensional art created by taking little pieces of glass or stone and kind of gluing them against the wall. Now, despite the fact that Emperor Justinian never stepped foot in Ravenna, he did sort of sponsor the building of this church, and he and his wife Theodora make an appearance. Okay, and these two mosaics, I'll show you the other one in a moment, they're both kind of facing each other with the altar of the church in between, so they're in a very prominent kind of place. And both that mere fact and the actual substance of the mosaics themselves, as we'll see, are really great examples of Caesaropapism in action. You're going to read about Caesaropapism. Take the word for Caesar or emperor and papism, referring to the Pope, bring them together. Caesaropapism. It's basically the idea that we see in the Eastern Church, the Byzantine Church, that in a sense, the emperor, despite not being a bishop, the emperor is sort of the head of the church and is a kind of religious and even sacred figure. And we'll come to Justinian in a moment. But right now we're looking at Theodora. There's a kind of nimbus around her head signifying her holiness. What she's holding in her hand is the chalice for the Lord's Supper, so this great sacred object. And if you look at it just from an artistic point of view, this is a great example of Byzantine art, because you have these, very sort of bright colors. Maybe hard to tell, but she's wearing a purple cloak to signify her royal nature. Byzantine art like this tends to be very two-dimensional, very flat, no real attempt to create the illusion of depth. It also seems very artificial in the way that everyone is sort of like the same height, unless you're a very important person, a VIP like Theodora, and then you're a little bit taller, and of course that lets everybody know that you're a big deal. Also, everyone is, frontally oriented. You don't have a kind of variety of poses and postures and so forth. So again, opposite the apse from this mosaic is the one with Theodora's husband, Justinian. It looks like he may be holding a big loaf of bread. He's actually not holding a big loaf of bread, but he is holding what's called a paten, P-A-T-E-N, which held it's kind of a bowl that held the communion bread. And look at who forms his entourage. You have priest, you have the bishop Maximianus to his left, our right. But of course, on the left, Justinian's right, there are soldiers with spears and a shield with the Chi Rho symbol on it, that X, and it looks like a P, but that's a rho in Greek, the first two letters of Christ's name, so it's a Christian symbol. So what you see here is an extremely graphic example of Caesaropapism. This idea that church and state are perfectly aligned, deeply, deeply integrated, so that there really is no separation between the two. So you have soldiers bearing Christian symbols. You have the emperor himself who is bringing communion bread beside the priest. So I think in many ways this imagery speaks for itself. I want to look at the apse mosaic that is sort of between the two that we've already seen. And I mainly want to look at this again because you can see even as late as the mid-6th century, we have a depiction of Jesus that I think in some ways seems strange to us. An extremely young Jesus who is not necessarily the good shepherd here, but he is beardless, as we have already seen him before. All right, so that's the first church that was built sort of during Justinian's reign, under Justinian's patronage, that we're going to look at. The other church is even more famous. This is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, where Justinian himself was based. Now, looking at this image, you see those towers, 4 towers. You need to kind of like mentally erase those, because those are minarets, which are sort of Islamic towers where someone climbs to the top and makes the call of prayer. Eventually, after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. It was later converted into a museum, and actually there was an announcement last year, very controversial announcement. The Hagia Sophia is going to be converted back into a mosque. So this continues to be a building that that creates a lot of passion from people. But if you want to imagine what the Hagia Sophia looked like originally, you have to kind of mentally scrub out those minarets. So here is a kind of cross section of the basic plan. You can see that, like San Vitale, it is not a basilica. It is a central plan church. And of course, you've already seen this impressive dome, and you've also can see these sort of smaller domes and half domes and so on. So what do we take from that? Well, we take a couple of different things. I mean, for one thing, I think we should just sort of acknowledge the complexity and the engineering feat that is this building. But also, we see that, you know, as late as Justinian's time, Roman architectural forms, the round Roman arches, domes. I mean, think back to the Pantheon. These are still really important for Byzantine art. And again, we see this sort of conflation of church and empire. This church was not just commissioned by Justinian, but it was meant to serve sort of as the official imperial church. Not just every Joe Sixpack could attend a service at the Hagia Sophia. You really had to be sort of in the imperial family or of the imperial court. I also want to highlight the fact that, you know, even as during this time, 6th century, things are in a pretty dire state in some ways in Western Europe, in the kind of aftermath of the collapse of the Roman Empire. But in the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire is still very wealthy. And just to give you an idea, in the construction of the Hagia Sophia, 40,000 pounds of silver were used. The altar itself was made of pure gold. The floors were made of marble. So the Byzantine Empire remained very wealthy, very culturally sophisticated, even as Western Europe was dealing with poverty and a kind of profound simplification, to put it nicely, of culture. All right, I want to make one last comment about sort of Byzantine art before we move to Islamic art. Oh, yes, here's a shot of the interior of the Hagia Sophia, which again is impressive and just gives you a sense of not just the wealth of the Byzantine Empire, but its mathematical engineering sophistication. I mean, nothing remotely on this level is being built in Western Europe at this point. Okay. Last point I want to make, I want to talk about the icon. Now, literally an icon just means a religious image, but I'm going to be using icon in a slightly more technical sense. The icon in many ways becomes in the Byzantine Empire, which, by the way, lasts until 1453. The icon becomes the predominant form of religious painting in the Byzantine Empire. We could define an icon in this narrower sense as an image whose purpose is purely devotional. I'm taking that from the textbook Art Across Time. The icon is an image whose purpose is purely devotional. And this early icon of St. Peter is a good example. You have the halo, you have the figure sort of pushed forward toward the picture plane in a frontal pose. You have some kind of significant hand gesture. In this case, he's clutching the keys that belong to Peter and to his descendants. It is a very two-dimensional kind of space. It's flat. We already commented on that on the San Vitale mosaics. The point of an icon is not naturalism. The point of an icon is to invite the viewer into a disposition of prayer and contemplation, to bring, in some ways, the viewer out of this world into a more heavenly, ethereal realm. Okay. And again, you're going to be reading in West in the World about a big controversy that breaks out in the Byzantine Empire about whether or not it's a good thing to have images, icons such as this, plastered not only over all these churches, but on people's homes and workshops and so on and so forth. I will go ahead and spoil the drama for you and tell you that ultimately icons are vindicated in the Byzantine Empire. And this is one of the reasons why, if you know anything about Eastern Orthodox Christianity today, you know that icons are extraordinarily important to that religion. And part of that is because Eastern Orthodox Christians really had to fight for them. Okay, I'm going to try to finish as quickly as I can. This week is significant because it's the week that you're being introduced by a couple of different ways to the religion of Islam. So I realize you may or may not have read West in the World yet. You may or may not have heard Dr. Farmer's lecture. I'm not necessarily going to assume that you have, although it might help if you have. We're just going to look at two Islamic buildings, which are both significant in their own right and are both significant because they sort of give you a sense of the main characteristics of Islamic art and architecture. So this is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, of course, built in the late 7th century. So very, very early. I mean, this is in the early decades of the existence of Islam. This is not a mosque. This is a shrine meant to commemorate the place where Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, ascended into heaven and was given a tour of the heavens. One of the first things to say about this is that, Islamic art borrowed pretty heavily at times from Byzantine art. And of course, you can see that immediately in not only the fact that we have a dome here, but it is a gold dome, and gold tends to be the preferred color of Byzantine art. Moreover, it is a kind of central plan building. in the tradition of San Vitale and the Hagia Sophia. Now, I want to give you a closer image here. You'll notice that the exterior, the facade of the Dome of the Rock is richly decorated. It's very colorful. But let's start with what you don't find here. What you don't find is representational art. Okay, you don't find images of people. You don't find images of God. And that's because there are very strict prohibitions against any kind of depiction of God and of any kind of depiction, especially of Muhammad. Okay, that is a big no-no in Islam, to represent the prophet through art. But none of this means that Islam is anti-art. Clearly, there's a love of color, there's a love of geometry, there's a love of pattern, and there's a love of calligraphy. Notice that Arabic calligraphy you can see in the frieze there toward the top. Okay, so whatever you want to say about Islam, you can't say that it is a religion against beauty or against, visual stimulation. The second building I want to look at is a mosque. A mosque is just a gathering place for prayer. This is found in Cordoba in southern Spain. Now, it's now a Catholic church, but it was originally a mosque and was the largest mosque in Europe. And I wanted to give you this image because it gives you a sense of the sheer scale here. I mean, this is an enormous campus that we're talking about here. It's also very early. Construction began on it in the late 8th century. What we're looking at here is a mihrab, or a prayer niche. Every mosque is going to have a wall with a prayer niche, and the orientation, as I'm sure you probably know, is always going to be towards Mecca. Okay, so this is a standard feature of a mosque. If we look at this image from the interior of the mosque, several things I think stand out. Again, we see borrowings from the Greco-Roman tradition, especially in those sort of Corinthian style capitals and in the round Roman arches. But we see a twist. Notice those are double arches. You basically have sort of an arch stacked on top of another arch. And that's something rather distinctive about this building. And again, we see the love of pattern and the love of color and complexity. And finally, wanted to show you this image from the dome of the Great Mosque, again, as a reminder of the way that early Islamic architecture borrowed sort of Greco-Roman and Byzantine forms and sort of did their own thing with them. And again, you can see the love of pattern, of these kinds of like botanical motifs and that sort of thing. Okay, I've gone on long enough. I'm going to stop right there.